Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, episode 46, and it's good to have you today as we get into nuclear energy with Dr. Levin, who is a professor at Southern Illinois University. And you can check out his full bio, which is way too much for me to read. He's done a lot in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com. Be sure to check it out. A lot of good information there. Nuclear energy. Hey, one of the things is with this Paris Climate Agreement, and this interview was recorded before the Paris Climate Agreement, so just so you know that. But with this Paris Climate Agreement, it's got me thinking, is nuclear a way that we could work on ways to reduce carbon emissions and provide clean, long-term energy? So in the future, we are going to address that topic. Unfortunately, Dr. Levin wasn't on before the Paris Climate Agreement, so we couldn't get that to him. But I think you will find our conversation fascinating. So here it is. Stanford, welcome to the show today. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're going to get into nuclear energy, and I'm curious what kind of got you on this career path that this is of interest to you?
Well, actually, a couple months after I started at the university, and that was in 1972, we got a letter from the legal aid people in the area asking for someone to help them out on a case. And so I've been doing energy. That, I think, was an electricity proceeding, and I've been working on energy off and on ever since.
Okay. Now, nuclear energy, I think, is one of these topics, like a lot of things in energy, that's really confusing. We hear a lot of talk about it's dangerous, and then we hear a lot of talk about it's really clean. Can you just kind of maybe set a table for us? For someone who may not be in nuclear, how should we think about nuclear energy? Is it really this dangerous? Is it really this clean? Is it something we should pursue as a nation? Just kind of, a 30,000-foot view, set a parameter for us.
Well, I think you have to put it in perspective. There's risks to any sort of generation, of generating electricity. I think nuclear power is safe. And now we're finding with the global warming and the environment that it has really attractive attributes. What people ignore is that when we burn fossil fuels, we put pollutants into the air and negative health consequences to that. So while people focus on some nuclear catastrophe, which really hasn't happened, they don't pay attention to the harm that comes from burning oil and gas and coal on a less obvious way, but people suffer from air pollution.
I think one of the things that I'm confused about, and I've heard kind of a variety of people weigh in on this, is the storage of the nuclear waste. You don't get into the weeds for us, but just kind of give us an overview. If storage nuclear waste, is it really that big of a risk, or is it kind of one of those things that might be overhyped?
It's not a risk, but I fault the federal government here because they have been they collect money from every utility that operates a nuclear power plant, which is designed to pay for long-term nuclear waste storage. And this has been going on for many years, and the government has not developed the centralized nuclear waste storage. So right now we have nuclear waste stored mostly at every nuclear plant. It's safe, but it would be better to have it in a central location. The administration right now is trying to revive this Yucca Mountain site in Nevada. Perhaps that will go forward.
You mentioned the administration there. We've talked a lot on the show about President Trump's America First energy policy. And we know he's appointed Rick Perry. Rick Perry seems to talk high of nuclear. What is your perspective of the administration and what they're going to do with nuclear in the future?
Well, this Secretary Perry has certainly come out in favor of nuclear power as part of an overall energy policy, and I think that's really good. At the same time, the administration is talking about significant reductions in the budget for the Department of Energy and for nuclear power efforts. So there's some contradictory signals coming out of the administration.
Okay, and so what role do you think that nuclear energy will play, or could play at least, in kind of this this new, what I'm kind of looking at as the energy market is changing. you've kind of talked about this a little bit, is that there's a big push on climate change and there's a big push against oil and gas. And it seems now that a lot of people that I talk to are believing that, hey, why don't we look at a multifaceted system that comes in and says, we use wind, we use solar, we use nuclear, we use oil and gas. We kind of balance out the market where they complement each other. What are your thoughts on how can nuclear fill those kind of gaps in the marketplace?
The answer to your simple question is a little complicated. What you have to understand is that wind and solar, which are referred to as renewables, are what we call intermittent. In other words, the power is available when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing, and at other times we have to have backup power. Now, nuclear power plants are very attractive because they have no emissions. They're as clean as you can get, but they have to run all the time. You can't turn them on and off to compensate for the wind not blowing or a cloudy day or it's nighttime. So we need to have nuclear power. It's good to have renewables, but we need to also provide the backup power for renewables. And what's happening now is because the laws in most states are kind of rigged in favor of renewables, that we run the risk of shutting down some nuclear power plants, which is going to have the effect of increasing emissions, not decreasing.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second. What goes on when you shut down a nuclear power plant? I mean, that just sounds kind of like, is that barren wasteland, or can the land be fixed? I don't know the proper term here. I'm grasping for straws, but you see where I'm going at. What happens when you shut down a nuclear power plant? What are some of the blowback you might get from that?
Okay, let me back up for a minute and explain why this is an issue, and then I'll answer that question. If we have to shut down a nuclear power plant prematurely when it still could be operating, and replace that, so that's zero emissions, and we replace that with some renewables and backup power, which might be, we hope, natural gas, but maybe it's coal or oil, then emissions have gone up. Okay, so we move to renewables and have the perverse effect of increasing emissions. Now, when you shut down a nuclear power plant, it has to be decommissioned. So it has to be made safe. The utilities have been collecting money as they go along to decommission their power plants. That's a long process, okay? But there's not a lot of land at stake. Nuclear power plants don't take up a lot of land. And these things basically need to be cleaned up and taken apart, and that's not going to happen real quickly. But we've been extending licenses. So original licenses were 40 years. Most of the plants are getting extensions for 20 more years.
Okay, when you say shut them down prematurely, that kind of, at least to me, sounds like that there is a life expectancy of one of these plants. Can you kind of break down that term? Why are you saying the term prematurely?
Well, if I built a nuclear power plant that can run for 60 years generating electricity, and I shut it off after 40 years or 50 years, we're not getting the full value from it. And that's what I mean when I say it's been shutting down prematurely. It's being shut down before its useful life is over.
I got you. And just for kind of a balance sake, let's say you shut down a nuclear power plant. How long does it take to construct one and to get one going?
Well, there are 4 under construction in the U.S. right now. This is a process that can take several years, maybe as long as 10 years. You first have to get approvals from various agencies, certainly federal and often state agencies, to build the plant, and then it's a very complicated construction process. And the problem, it's interesting, when people have had problems with constructing nuclear power plants, it's not because of the nuclear technology, but it's basically nuts and bolts construction, because the plant, it's very, very complicated to build one. I've actually toured a nuclear power plant, and I got some idea of why they can cost billions of dollars. So it's a long process, but yeah, we have experience. I think there's about 190 some maybe now, or 100 nuclear power plants operating in the country, and there are 4 more under construction.
So what you're saying then is that it takes 5 to 10 years to get one of these online. So shutting one down prematurely, if there was a need for another one, it really kind of puts a logjam in the system. Is that kind of what I'm understanding?
Yeah, I mean, these are not things that get built quickly. You're talking about multi-billion-dollar projects, and so it takes a long time to shut them down. It takes a long time to replace them, and it seems foolish to shut down a nuclear power plant before its useful life is over when we're trying to reduce emissions and react to something about global warming.
Okay, for the audience, could you do us a favor here and say, okay, let's take nuclear energy and let's kind of compare it to oil and gas and renewables and just kind of break it down and say, here's where nuclear may have benefits against its competitors.
Well, the attraction with nuclear power plants are that they have zero emissions, and they tend to be available certainly 95% of the time, and sometimes and often more. So they're almost always available. It's unusual to have an unplanned shutdown, and they have no emissions. I mean, we had a situation in Illinois a couple of years ago where the coal plants couldn't function in extremely cold weather because basically the coal froze. They had these piles of coal and they couldn't get it into the plant. So nuclear plants are extremely reliable and they're zero emissions. What more do you want?
Okay, so let me ask this then. For someone who might be listening and says, okay, well, I might want to get into nuclear. Where's a good starting spot? What would you recommend? Some resources, some tools, maybe some lecture series of books. What would you say to someone who's interested into learning more about the nuclear sector of the energy space?
Well, people might look at the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is an industry association, and they have a website. And also any of the utilities like Exelon, for instance, that are major nuclear plant operators would have information on their website. Someone with a casual interest isn't going to be a nuclear engineer, so I think that the nuclear engineering textbooks are probably not what you're thinking of.
Right. Okay, so final question. I meant to ask this earlier, and I forgot, so I got to come back around to it now. You've kind of touched on this earlier, and you said that there's not really this threat from meltdowns. One of the things I've heard, and I would love to hear your opinion, is Fukushima, I think, was the plant in Japan that melted down a few years ago, correct? Is that the right name of it?
Yes, I'm not sure that I would say it melted down, but certainly there was a big problem in Japan.
Sure, yeah. Don't let me. I'm just using the layman terms here. One of the things that I heard was some BBC reporters went over there. I think it was last year, and they walked through the area and they went behind the barricaded area and they were measuring the radiation. And they said it really wasn't that much in the area. And they said that the government was kind of being overly cautious about letting people in the area. But when you went inside this area, and I don't know how close they were to the reactors and all that, but they went inside the barricaded zone. And they come to find out, according to this report, that really there wasn't that much danger as much as it had been hyped up. And so when you said earlier about the kind of this fear of these catastrophes, can you walk us through what is the realistic kind of, not worst case scenario, but what is happening when you see something like a Fukushima or what's going on, and what is the long-term impact on the environment?
Yeah, well, I don't think what happened in Japan would happen in the U.S. There have been warnings about safety things in Japan. Also, Japan operates a large number of small nuclear power plants, whereas we tend to have a small number of larger ones, which seems to be much easier to operate. Nothing is risk-free. Okay, so it's possible that you can have some nuclear accident that would release radiation. It's unlikely to happen, and you have to balance that against the pollutants that are being dumped into the air and the carbon dioxide that gets put in the air from burning fossil fuels. So nothing is risk-free. That's all I can say.
Okay, well, that was helpful. And thank you so much for your time. Obviously, this is a subject that we haven't got to cover much on the show, and so it's good to get someone who understands it, and I appreciate your time today. Okay,
thank you. Glad to do it.
Thanks again to Stanford for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion. Be sure to check out his full bio and all of his information in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com, and let me know in the contact form at Global Energy Media. What do you think? Can nuclear be a viable solution to meet lower carbon emissions in the U.S. and abroad over the next couple decades. Look forward to hearing back from you on that. The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.